All right, Nick, it's a new week, man, and we're rolling off of another Sunday mission and thinking about what's next. And I think what I've discovered is when people are tuning into this, it seems like they're checking out the relevant conversations we're having to the predicament at hand. Also, that we're all getting a little YouTube and zoomed out, and maybe not needing quite as much information flow as we did. So we're trying to talk about maybe the most pressing questions that we can think of. And I think that one of the ones that's heavily on my mind, I think people are starting to have it now. I think that we'll be on a little bit on the front end of having this conversation with our church, but is how do we handle the impending reopening of the state, and how that's going to differ from the reopening of the country potentially, the way that it's talked about from a national versus a local level. And then how are we going to handle the divergent opinions within our own church on this? And so obviously we're not coming to this with a plan that we're presenting to you. So don't take this as the plan. And we're not going to solve it all, but we want to kind of get at how we want you all to think about this and treat each other and work with us as we, try to think this through. So,
yeah, it's a really light, easy, uncomplicated topic. So I'm really thankful for that.
Yeah, super thankful.
Yeah.
I think one of the indicators for me is the way that I'm starting to hear people speak about each other in our church, but especially about other church communities. And I'm thinking to myself, the difference between some of us and other church communities, I think it exists in our church as well. So what have you seen? What are the early murmurings that you're noticing, Nick, on this topic?
On this topic, well, I mean, obviously, we've both listened to the Zach Yenser show regarding opening, so that's a thing.
Yeah, Zach Yenser's, if you don't know, he's a radio show host. Is a believer, goes to a church, where friends of ours are at, and he's got a radio show where he just discussed all this. Yeah.
So that was interesting. Honestly, I'm hearing the continued tug of war that I have been hearing, but in a new light.
Right.
But with the added middle ground of a staggered open, we don't want to continue to self-isolate, but we need to do this in steps in order to ensure that this is going to be done correctly.
Yeah.
So, and honestly, I think people just are getting tired of staying home.
Oh yeah, no doubt.
Like cabin fever is a thing, and the long for human physical interaction. That's a big, huge takeaway. It's like physical gatherings are really, really, really important. Like when he says, "Don't forsake the gathering of the saints," that's not meant to be taken lightly, and I think we just learned why.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I definitely have. I feel like there's a group that is, let's see, how do I say this? I'd say that there are people who are suffering because of the lockdown. I think there are different dividing lines here. There's ideological and there's experiential. Experiential is you're suffering because of lockdown. You're like, look, something's got to give, and you're like. And so maybe it's not so much about church and religious liberty or whatever, though I'm sure some people are thinking about that too. It's more just about the practicalities of like, look, this can't go on like this. There's something's got to give. And then there's a group of folks who aren't necessarily suffering as much from the lockdown, who are also very comfortable with it, and who feel like added on top of that it's a big safety risk to reopen. And it's very hard for those two groups of people to understand each other because of that experiential gap.
Yeah, and I think the problem is we argue from Like if you're arguing your point of view, you're seeing all the good that you have.
Right.
Who's the person you're arguing against? But in the reality, like if we're going to take some of the issues that I've heard of, like loving your neighbor, that is
Cool. I'm just recording something on YouTube. You want to be on it with me? Real bad. Yeah.
Andy's neighbor is a delight. Is that your neighbor?
That's my neighbor.
I've really gotten to know a lot of
neighbors. I can't talk to you about it because I'm on it right now. I'll tell you later.
That's great. And I don't think we should remove that from the recording.
Yeah.
So anyway, what I was saying is, if I have an argument, I'm stating things that I'm passionate about and that I can have like biblical Christian Bible verses to back it. Biblical Christian Bible verses should not make sense. But ideals behind it. But the person that I would be debating would have the same.
Yeah.
So here, like, this is about freedom. This is about economics. This is about loving your neighbor. This is about safety. Actually, every one of those things is a good thing.
Yeah.
They're all beautiful things designed by God. And so it's really, really important right now to take a step back and say, if I disagree with someone, is their argument inherently evil, or are they fighting for something good? They just have a different perspective on how to handle crisis than I do.
And probably not only a different perspective, but a different set of problems, and a different set of convictions, and all sorts of stuff. Probably problems and their actual life experience is like a bigger thing coming into it. Like, this is really going to mess up things, and yeah. So anyway, I've seen that, and then I've seen another two classes, and one class is one who I think has experienced this shutdown and pandemic. Was maybe they felt some fear, they felt some stuff, and now they don't feel that fear anymore. They're kind of like, I don't know anybody who's getting sick, or the people around me aren't. It's not happening, or there's something of that nature, and they're starting to relax. Mm-hmm. And then there's a group that is not relaxing. They're still feeling very afraid, and they have good reasons for that. Probably there's health. Maybe somebody they know has died, or they have a pre-existing condition themselves, or died in the past, or whatever it is, like, where it's not so easy for them to go, okay, I'm feeling better. I'm feeling more free. I've noticed in general that our city, the roads are getting busy again. It feels like there's a general, I went up to Matt and Brenna's wedding on Mount Lemon, and holy cow.
It was packed. It's packed up there, man.
Nuts. Yeah.
Nobody's distancing up there.
No. So it's like there's whatever the mayor, the governor says is one thing. There's also just what people are starting to do, and wrapping their mind around that. Like, that's.
I would definitely assume, and maybe I'm overreaching, but I would assume that people are gathering in homes and just not telling anybody.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the case. I've heard people who they even feel like they're going to get knocked, like, for not social distancing, but they're getting together with people.
Yeah.
And to different degrees, all sorts of different degrees. And I think even the people who are saying that they're scared are still getting together with certain people. And usually it's justifiable when you see the need yourself. You're like, I need this. I feel like I need this.
Yeah.
And so it's just, the truth is those lines are getting drawn in all sorts of different places for folks. Some of the things that Zach Yenser brought out that I thought were really valid in his show, and he interviewed a guy who had some really good data on this, it seemed, but basically he was saying reopening just can't look the same in every place in the country. It's not apples and oranges. Every city, every county, every situation is different. So there's going to have to be a different, journey to reopening. Yeah, and I think that's true for sure.
It's going to have to be different than New York.
Yeah.
You just have less people. There's less cramped lifestyle.
Yep.
And so New York is going to have to probably open way later than Tucson does.
Yeah, I would fully assume that's the case. And so it might be, the national versus the local conversations can be different. I think there's probably contextual conversations that are different. certain workplaces that are more risky than others, certain churches that the demographic is more risky than others, right?
Yeah,
There's
that's really
gonna
important.
there's going to be a lot of that. And so anyway, just so many variables. So Nick, if you were to say a couple of things to our church folks, maybe outside of any specifics, but I feel like what we just did right there is we just threw a bunch of mud in the water and just like stirred it up and said, look, the waters are muddy. It's complicated, right?
Yeah.
It's not simple. It's not one size fits all. There's no, whatever we choose to do, which we haven't really
Locked in yet.
No. And I honestly feel like we have to wait. I think forecasting what we're going to do to some degree is foolish. I think we can plan over some different scenarios, and we're not going to talk about any of that because it's not there, and we don't want you to start to
Analyze it.
and analyze it. But how do you want our people to treat each other, and how do you want us to deal with our different opinions? That's maybe more what I want to discuss.
One, I think what I would say, and this is just not what I tend to do naturally, but like enjoy the nuance of what this is. Like the fact that there's not a black and white, there just isn't. And generally I'm the black and white guy, but there's too many people and too many scenarios for me to actually believe that now.
Right.
So really enjoying one, like this is super complicated and God is working in each person's life differently.
Mm-hmm.
It's really, really cool. Piper just put out a book called Christ and Coronavirus. John Piper's just a beast. They're like, hey, we're going to do a lockdown. He's like, fine, I'm going to write a book and release 24 new podcasts.
Yeah.
Anyway, one of his ideals in that is like, hey, man, Jesus is doing something here. This is important. But two, if you disagree, it's probably because the person has a situation and is hearing things and living in a culture that maybe you're not. So I live in like this small business realm. Like the conversations that they're having are different than the conversations that people who have the ability to work from home and haven't lost pay, and maybe like don't have a family to support. Like those two viewpoints are radically different. And so this is an opportunity to learn the struggle and learn, how do I actually bear your burden? Because your burden, I don't understand and I don't know. And that is a beautiful means of coming alongside and saying, I can love my neighbor. Because just listening to them share their burden helps. Mm-hmm. Maybe you can enter into it and say, man, like maybe you didn't get any of the loans that you've been applying for, and you can't get on unemployment because you own an LLC. So maybe I can step in and help in a means. So what I would say is, for those who are saying we need to stay locked down, I would try to understand the situation of those who aren't. For those who are like, this is ridiculous, of which I'm related to many, I would say maybe the best way to love your neighbor is not to tell them a billion reasons why you're right and they're wrong, but to encourage them to follow their conscience and not sin against themselves.
Right. Yeah, I think so too. I do definitely think that one of the key things that's going to come up here is that we're going to have to learn to listen to one another closely and look for nuance and seek understanding. I think we're going to have to respect people's decisions that are different than ours, even if we think that they're wrong. And I mean, and in a way, I think this is like preparatory for us going into the election.
I'm agreeing. Sorry, Rosie's out here. She's asking questions.
Yeah, good job, Rosie. I think this is preparatory for us getting into like election time, because it's a similar thing. Like people, we're going to make choices that where we're aiming for something that we think is like potentially even God honoring, and we're going to disagree with each other on that. And somehow to be the church and to really be the people of God that are separate and distinct and who aren't just cut up on like one side of an issue or the other, we're going to have to accept, one another, even when we have some fundamental disagreements, and just choose to stay unified in Christ while we live out like the reopening in a different way.
Yeah.
And to speak well of each other and to be respectful of each other. I mean, I think that the going thing to do in our day, in our culture, is if you see somebody doing something you don't like, you rip them to shreds publicly to make a fool of them so that they can stop and so that other people don't do what they're doing. I think we're going to need to speak well of people and assume the best of one another and encourage one another. And if we're very, very deeply convicted, to share with an open hand that allows for the person to disagree with what we just shared. I think it's going to be incredibly, incredibly important. And I think it's going to be complicated, but I think that for us to live out our identity as Christians, it's just going to be 100% necessary. Yeah. Interestingly, both of our daughters decided to enter into the side frame somehow. This is the thing about doing this during the day.
Yeah.
So
yeah. Look, there's Bruce.
So I'm not going to answer your
question. Or I guess I think there's two ways that are super, super practical that we can go about this. And I think one is to assume that you can learn something from the person who disagrees with you.
Right.
You can learn something from anybody. But right now you need to put that on the forefront. Like, I can learn something from you because you have a different perspective, which means you probably have a different insight.
Right.
And then two, I think the second thought would be, don't assume everybody thinks exactly what you think. I can't agree with myself on a day-to-day basis. Right. Nonetheless, assume that everybody has the exact same point of view. And I think those two things coming back together will be very, very helpful, because there will be those who speak in a manner that, of course, and they'll ramble off whatever side view that they have. And then they'll just assume that everybody there logically just is there with them, but they're probably not.
Right.
Which means when you do that, innately, you're going to create tension and probably a little bit of shame or division. And that, we don't want that. And then when you do find out, oh, this person does disagree, what can I learn from them is the question.
Yeah.
And that's a state of humility, because you may be very passionate about the view that you've taken, and yet we're called to be gentle and wise. And so that's a good, beautiful place of humility.
I was thinking about a potential initiative that we could enact at the church, but one layer of it was this idea that we need to count other people more significant than ourselves. And so I think what that means is, like, at times like this, we need to, instead of asking the question of like, what do I want the outcome to be, to ask the question, what do you want the outcome to be, and what do you need, and how can I help you? And that's a tough thing to do. But I think if we start to take those approaches to people who have different opinions, like, what is your goal? What do you need? And how can I help you achieve that? I think it's going to reframe the question for us in many ways. And like I said, that's like more work, right? I mean, it's way easier to just disagree and say these people are idiots and stop going to church with them or anything like that. But that's not the call of the Christian. If we can't walk through something like a reopening unified and together, then we've got bigger issues. We can't do that. You get a lot of visits over there. You're a popular guy.
She's just unloading our closet and putting it on my desk, and I'm okay with this.
That's
because
good.
I'm making her greater than myself. But I will say one thing that I've seen, and I'm super proud of, is we did this, speaking of like loving your neighbor, we sent out that real quick from Wednesday to Friday. Yeah. Like, the refugee community has needs, and Vi orchestrated and organized the majority of that. It took me to catalog everything. It took me like 2.5 hours because our people gave so much.
Yeah.
So what I would say is that spirit of giving and that like spirit of kindness, that's what we need to continue in on.
Yeah.
Just moving forward in supplies for refugees and kindness.
We don't need this, Dad.
This is actually good mac and cheese.
Oh, yeah?
Bite. Yeah, I had a bite the other night when I made them some, and I was like, wow, not real cheese. Definitely not real cheese.
Yeah.
Don't know what it is, but it was tasty.
Well, yeah, I agree with you. I was also very proud of our people for responding the way they have. And we've seen other kind of behind the scenes acts of generosity that I believe people aren't even looking for acknowledgement for, or would rather that we didn't say. And so just so you all know, like, despite us addressing this, because we do see it coming, there are also so many encouraging things.
Yeah.
So many good things. And so I think I want our people to see that, to fight for the good, to forgive one another, to assume the best of each other, and to really look to understand each other. I think if we do that, we're going to come out of even a transition like this as a deeper, more connected church. Even though it could have the potential to split us apart and make us mad at each other or something like that.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's where our heads are at, I guess. And so
that's where I'm at.
As we begin to work through decisions on that, I would ask you all to pray for us, to pray that we would have wisdom and be led by God's Spirit and not just our reason and logic, because in many ways we don't know how to handle pandemics. You know, it's our first time. So yeah, if you'd pray for that, and just for the people of our church, and for peace, and for genuine love, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, I think assume that as pastors and elders, we are trying to do our best and we are good-willed. And then when we all do gather and we have differing opinions, assume that the person that is next to you is good-willed as well.
Yeah.
And that God calls all sorts of different people to respond in different ways. And that's a really cool thing.
Yeah. And often that tension that we have, the differences of opinion, bring us to a better place of consensus than if we didn't have those differences. So it helps.
You want to say hi? No. I feel like you want to say hi. No. She's
like, I want to be the star of this video, but I don't want to say hi.
Yeah.
All right, man. Well, let's sign off. Go play with your kids.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye.